The Daily Click used to be a powerhouse of a site, a bustling hub for hundreds of talented and enthusiastic game developers. Back in 2003, I wanted nothing more than to win Game of the Week on that site, but I was too intimidated by the scale of the scene there, and by the fact that everybody was older and better at making games than me. The site is still going, but its popularity has waned over the years, and the Click scene isn't what it used to be. Well, it sort of is. Still lots of platformer games and half-finished mega projects. But the site is still one that I like to visit from time to time, just to know that it's still there, and to be reminded of usernames that I would otherwise have long since forgotten. Back at the start of August this year, Josh Tech asked the community what they wanted from the site. I was a little disappointed that none of the options in the poll involved making games, so my brother proposed a game-making competition, featuring strict restrictions in order to channel the devs' efforts and to keep them from never finishing anything. 2 days later, a game-making competition was announced. Its theme? Time Trial by Fire. It needed fire, a timed element, and had to be skill-based, rather than luck. Well, I looked at that and thought, that doesn't fit my style of game-making at all. And while I'd have loved for it to be a competition to make a shooter game with awesome physics and AI, it's always been best for me that I'm forced to make something I wouldn't normally work on, as the result is typically a lot more unique, fun to play, and finished. Because when left to my own devices, my game-making ideas always start epic and then balloon in size further. And I never finish them. But my brother wasn't done yet. Josh Tech asked for further advice on how such a competition should be rated. One of the suggestions he put forward was for it to be a popularity contest, which my brother said was a bad idea and that it should be rated by judges and scored on the quality of the game rather than the number of upvotes it can acquire. And so my plan was foiled again. So I got to work on the game. I allocated 3 days to making it. But first, I spent a week just thinking about it, planning it all out and coming up with an idea that would work. I didn't bother with specifics, because the moment you start on the project, you immediately gain a better knowledge of what will and won't work. So this week of thinking was spent simply forming a rough outline of what the game was to be. I pictured the player's character spontaneously combusting, with the goal being to put himself out by jumping into a trough of water before his health reaches 0. But here's the catch. Your score is determined by how much damage you can cause before doing this. This was adequately silly, horrific, and fun sounding. I pictured numerous beautiful locations just waiting to be set alight, with one of these being a city street full of highly flammable people, wandering about and minding their own business. But would the Click community be ready for such a game? As expected, problems with my plan became immediately apparent once I commenced work on the game. For instance, having water as a limited resource, found in just a few spots around the level, felt too limiting. The appeal of the game comes from setting things on fire, and not from having to rush to the water to put yourself out before you die. And for so much of the experience to be spent making a beeline for the nearest water bucket kind of dampened the fun I was having from the game. It was a stroke of luck that I had this vision of a flaming person plummeting off a cliff into the water below, because this worked a lot better. Firstly, it was a lot more fun to end the level with a dramatic looking freefall, and secondly, this naturally resulted in more water, and thus it gave the player a lot more freedom to focus on the destruction instead. And I could dictate how difficult the worlds were by changing the size of the islands. I could, for instance, place the most valuable stuff to destroy in the centre of the bigger islands, thus making it riskier to traverse to them in case you time it wrong and die before you can leap off the side again. So cliffs became an unexpected but must-have feature for me to include. But having cliffs adds 2 new problems that I have to deal with. The first being height. Rather than it all being on the flat, my character now needs to be able to fall if they're off the side of these cliffs. And secondly, having cliffs complicates the ordering of the sprites. Remember, this is a 2D game trying to represent a 3D space. When everything's on the flat, it's easy to order these sprites by their Y value, so that things further down the screen are shown as being in front of the stuff above them. But now there's height as well to contend with, so if things are flying up in the air or down off the side of cliffs, this could confuse the ordering. And the grass tiles, which used to be simple backdrop objects behind everything else, now also need layering. They might end up being shown in front of stuff that's big enough to straddle more than one grass tile, like an oil spill or something like that. There are just lots of things to be aware of when you're integrating an extra mechanic such as this into a game. And I exacerbated all these problems with the layering when I doubled the height of the islands, for no reason other than because it made it funnier to watch the player fall off them. I could almost taste all those flaming civilians plummeting into the water below. I think the proper way to implement this would be to give everything a Z and Y value, and to fiddle with the ordering based on those numbers until it works okay. But this again would be an extra level of complexity that I'd have to contend with for the rest of the project, so I instead settled on a more botched solution. everything on the level would be represented on a single layer, apart from the cliff faces and water, which will be on a separate layer directly behind everything else. The botch comes from when the player falls off the island, at which point he will be transported from the main level into the background one. It's botched because this transition is inelegant, and I don't think you can get it fully working in all instances without a slightly jarring jump when he suddenly goes from being in front of the grass to being behind it. But it keeps things simple. The grass can be returned to being a simple background object without requiring layering. So that's one big problem avoided. And with a deadline of just 3 days, I need to keep my life as simple as possible, and this botched approach does just that, in exchange for just the tiniest bit of jank the moment the player falls off the side of the cliff at the end. That's a fair trade in my opinion, especially with this body being shrouded by the fire he's going to be engulfed by. For a while, when it was all just on one layer, I had the fall to be triggered when your character's position overlapped the water, but this runs the risk of people finding a way of escaping the level if they can somehow bypass the water surrounding the level. There's not a big risk of that happening, but it's far more elegant to have the player constantly trying to fall, only for it to be stopped whenever he's overlapping the grass instead, because then there's no way that a player can escape the level's confines without quickly falling far enough to end the round. Next, I needed to add the fire, but the big question was, how long should you be on fire for before you die? This is impossible to know at this point because it depends on so many factors that I haven't yet implemented into the game, like the size of the levels, the amount of stuff to be set on fire, and so on. I decided on 30 seconds as a placeholder amount of time per level, but it felt too long, a torturous amount of time for a player to be on fire for. And I wanted for there to be a sense of urgency, so quickly shortened that down to 20, which it remained at for the rest of the project. I considered having power-ups placed around to extend this length of time. This would have been a really cool way of extending the game's replayability, but it comes at a terrible price. It's a bit like the buckets of water. You don't want the playtime to be spent avoiding death by making it into a beeline to the power-ups. You want for this time alive to be focused around destroying stuff, so I decided to keep the levels a strict 20 seconds long, meaning that I could tailor a music track to be that exact length of time, which would allow players to subconsciously know how long they have left without needing to constantly look at the health bar across the top of the screen. All this wouldn't be possible if I added time delaying power-ups into the mix. And what about the time before the player spontaneously combusts? If it's instant, then there's no strategy to it, but if it's too long, then too much of the playtime would be spent preparing for the run. So I settled on there being 3 seconds before spontaneous combustion kicked in, just to add a slight element of strategy to that first few seconds. Having to make blind decisions like these has become my favourite bit of game development. Here I am, developing a game type that I've never played before, and yet I'm being forced to make long-term decisions about how it'll play before I've even played the game myself. It's thrilling, it's like I'm pioneering something completely new, and battling problems which have never even existed until this very moment. I must be basing all my decisions about these things on something, relying on past experiences as a game developer perhaps. And it's not necessarily about making the right decisions, it's just about avoiding the wrong ones. A constant assessment of time invested versus payoff. At this point, I had been working on the game for about 2 hours, and it felt almost finished. Just add stuff to burn, throw in a couple of levels, and I'm about there. But don't be fooled. Game development always slows down. That's an alarming rate. I can't really say why, but the first thing you add is always the fastest and easiest, I guess because you're not having to battle against the other things you've already added into the game, and because you haven't yet started the time-consuming but rewarding process of playtesting. But now it was finally time to add the scoring system. This meant adding the stuff your player's going to set fire to, and to give them all a score value. I started with some flammable barrels that could be tipped over to spill their flammable liquid in a particular direction, because that seemed cool and I thought had deeper gameplay than I could perhaps appreciate at this stage. I wanted wooden flammable structures to be the focus of the destruction, but it never came to be, and I had to settle on bushes instead, which in turn would ignite nearby bushes, setting off a chain reaction. I think out of everything, the bushes are the most boring to set fire to. They remind me a lot of the wood harvesting mechanic from Assassin's Creed Odyssey. When you're going from A to B, you'll find trees and rocks dotted about, and you end up making slight corrections to your path to harvest the optimum amount. It doesn't give you much, but it just makes those boring bits of your journey a little bit more engaging, and rewards perfection. So that's how I see the bushes in this game as well. Add to that their long burn time, and they feel like a long-term investment of sorts. The bridges are similar to the bushes, but I thought should score the most highly because by burning these, you're literally burning bridges that you might later want to cross again. So that's their unique gameplay mechanic. It's amazing how much you forget over the course of several days. I thought I'd come up with this, but apparently, looking back at my notes, this was a suggestion from a friend. So all of these flammable things have something in common. Yes, they burn, but they all behave a little differently, to help add variety and strategy to your flaming carnage spree. I was imagining dozens of different things for you to burn in each level, I guess because variety's cool, but due to time constraints, I was limited to implementing just a few different flammable object types in this project, and I don't think it suffered for it. In fact, it forced me to be more creative with the ones that were added. For instance, the oil drums would explode, but wouldn't it be cool if this also launched your player up into the air? I mean, I had already gone to the trouble of programming in the islands and the falling mechanic, so all I had to do was to make the explosion add a negative falling speed to the player's body, and all of a sudden this game had an island hopping mechanic. Almost like it was meant to be. If you played the end result of this game, you'd think that this island hopping mechanic was fundamental to the game's development. It's as though it's what the game's all about. But it was all born out of luck, a product of many unrelated decisions leading up to that moment. It's so easy to look at the final game and to be like, well, it's obvious a player launching mechanic was needed, but having approached it from the beginning, it wasn't to me. But the moment it was added, it felt like I had slotted in that missing jigsaw piece that made the rest suddenly make sense. Again, there is probably a proper way of adding all these mechanics to the game, but I rushed through it all, botching the implementation of each without a care of how it would interfere with the rest later on. I am a big believer in quantity over quality. It is always better to rush to completion and to spend the remaining time ironing out the bugs at the end, than it is to get bogged down with perfection and to never finish something, which is the alternative whether you like it or not. For instance, for a while the bridge would ignite even if the player wasn't yet on fire. This was due to my botched approach to the programming in the first place, but it was quickly and easily remedied once discovered. How do I go about scoring a game about a man on fire who's running about setting everything on fire? Should the points rack up as the things are burning, or just when they're destroyed completely? Both approaches have their merits. Gradual point accumulation as the things burn means that the score could tick up like a spinning roulette wheel, with more things on fire being represented by a faster and more frantic clicking sound. But I decided against this. Such a sound could become annoying, and I don't really want my game associated so directly with gambling. So I instead settled on the point scoring coming from the eventual destruction of the object in question, and treated the delay leading up to that moment as being a gameplay mechanic that the player would have to factor in when planning their route of destruction, and how closely they wanted to cut their leap into the water at the end of the level. Scoring the points in a final large lump sum like this, especially when accompanied by a memorable sound effect, felt like the most rewarding payoff. I considered a video gamey one-up sound, but never got around to it, so the sounds of destruction would have to do. I mentioned gambling for a reason. I hate what money-based transactions in CSGO has done to the game. On one hand, it has earned a multi-billion-dollar corporation a huge amount of extra money. But on the other hand, I feel it's got a lot of children into gambling, has lost a lot of poor people an embarrassing amount of money, has made a lot of people less happy, and has devalued a game series that I've been following since my childhood. But as the developer of games, I'm aware of how closely related the reward structures of gambling and gaming are from one another. When I look at the games I enjoy, I'm aware that it's engaging in risky behaviour that I find the most enjoyable. So it was only a matter of time before companies made the direct connection between these two things. But for me, I want gambling in my games to be reserved to an addictive gameplay mechanic, as opposed to being used to milk my player base dry. Rant over. What's the difference between fire and explosions? There is obviously a difference, but it wasn't something I had thought about for this project until it was staring me right in the face. Thanks to me foolishly rushing through development up to this point, I now had to backtrack and define where and when fire and explosions would be used. Explosions were to be easy ways of igniting lots of stuff, but they themselves need to be difficult to ignite in the first place. So by having them come from barrels, which can only really be ignited once they're tipped up and have had their spilt oil ignited, this helped solve that problem, and helped add an element of strategy to the plan of destruction. But this meant that I also had to give everything a degree of fire resistance, that things didn't just instantly combust upon contact with the player or other fires. Getting this balance just right was key to having this game feel rewarding rather than frustrating, or for it to be too easy. Suddenly, having to strike a balance between explosions, fire, and flame resistance presented me with a load of new essential gameplay mechanics that needed to be implemented that I hadn't previously planned for. And yet more things to balance off against each other. And to add to that, a load of new bugs had been added to the mix following the newly added launch mechanic. Like where I found myself igniting bridges and knocking over oil drums even when I was flying high over them in the air. I fixed these things in the name of realism, but later on I backtracked in some ways in the name of fun gameplay. I had to compromise on the shadows in this game. I normally have a layer dedicated to them, since they're an easy way to make the graphics look better. But it detracted from the gameplay for them to be at an angle. It was far easier to represent the player's position when the shadow for him was at ground level directly below him. Gameplay came first and foremost for this project, but it did mean sacrificing pretty looking shadows, which I am sad about. As I neared the end of the first day of development, I had myself a working game, But it wasn't really a game, it was just a man on fire running about wildly setting everything on fire before plopping into the ocean before his health ran out. I was blind to this project's future. Would this just be a silly idea that people would immediately tire of? How could I go about making it into a game with replayability? I'd sleep on it, and tackle problems such as these tomorrow.